And if we move from the greatest ocean sphere into the greatest forest, we enter the Amazon, a stretch of rainforest the size of the face of the full moon, the size of the continental United States, and we enter the homeland of a people of the anaconda, the Barasana, a people who lived so closely with that forest that cognitively they did not distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the heavens was equated to the canopy of the rainforest. Or if we slip a little bit further south into the homeland of the Waorani, and the notorious group of indigenous people first contacted peacefully in 1958, 5 years after I was born, even though they live as a crow flies but 100 kilometers from the national capital of Quito in Ecuador. What made the Waorani so extraordinary is that at the time of contact, they were feared as known, and they were known as the Auca, a pejorative term in Quechua meaning savages. And the Waorani were remarkable also because when in 1957, 5 missionaries attempted contact, they made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8x10 glossy photographs of themselves and what we would say to be friendly gestures, forgetting that these people of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. So they picked up the photographs from the forest floor, looked behind the face to try to find the form to the figure, found nothing, and concluded that these were calling cards from the devil, and so they promptly speared the 5 missionaries to death. But the Waorani didn't just spear outsiders. 54% of their mortality was due to them spearing each other. We traced genealogies back 8 generations when I lived amongst the Waorani, and we only found 2 cases of natural death. And when we pursued them a little bit about it, they admitted that one of the fellows had gotten so old that he died getting old, so we speared him anyway. But they had this incredible knowledge of the forest as hunters. Their hunters could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left that behind. And that kind of empirical attentiveness to nature is what gave rise to this remarkable knowledge of medicinal and toxic and hallucinogenic plants. Plants like this one, the curare, the flying death, the arrow poison that yielded D2-bucurarine, the muscle relaxants that revolutionized modern medicine in the 1940s. And inevitably, this brings us into the realm of the shaman. And when I had initially worked as a botanical explorer, I was always told by my professor, the legendary Amazon botanist Richard Evans Schultes, that I should always remember the adage of Paracelsus, who said that the difference between a poison and a medicine and a narcotic was simply dosage. And in entering this sort of realm of the shaman, the first thing you have to do is understand that a chasm exists between our perception of the nature of health and healing in the allopathic tradition versus how the shamanic tradition sees the nature of mind, body, and spirit. We have this kind of image of the shaman from Shirley MacLaine as this sort of benign figure with feathers and bells who sings to you. I've never actually met a shaman who wasn't a little psychotic. That's their job. They're the ones who swim, as Joseph Campbell said, in the mystic waters the rest of us would drown in. And the essence of the shamanic art of healing is the idea that disease is not simply caused by the presence of pathogens, but it comes about as a sort of an imbalance between the various components of the individual. It's addressing this imbalance that is so essential. So yes, diseases can be treated symptomatically, and often with medicinal plants, which may be pharmacologically active, but critically that mundane level of somatic treatment is seen to be of this world. The real challenge for the shaman is to invoke some technique of ecstasy, to soar away on the wings of trance, to get into those metaphysical realms where he can work his true deeds of mystical and medicinal and magical rescue. And that really accounts for the disproportionate distribution of the so-called entheogens, or the hallucinogenic plants. Science has identified perhaps 120 around the world. 95% are from the Americas, not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia were depauperate, but simply because, as we'll see in a moment, people there had other avenues to the divine. In the Americas, the route to the Godhead was always these curious plants. And we're drawn to these plants for 2 reasons, not simply their dazzling effects, such as this one, Ebene, the semen of the sun, derived from the blood-red resin of several species in the genus Virola in the nutmeg family. These powders are full of tryptamines, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine. My friend Terence McKenna used to say to have this stuff blown up your nose was like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. it didn't create the distortion of reality, it created the disillusion of reality. In fact, I used to argue with my professor Schultes that you couldn't classify this as being hallucinogenic because by the time you were under its influence, there was no one home anymore to experience the hallucination. But what we're interested about these plants is not just their stunning pharmacological effects, but what they tell us about a different way of knowing. I'm sure you've all heard of ayahuasca, the vision vine, the vine of the soul, the most complex preparation of the shaman's repertoire. And what makes it so interesting is you'll notice those tryptamines are taken up the nose. That's because they cannot be taken orally because they're denatured by an enzyme found naturally in the human stomach, monoamine oxidase. They can only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other plant that denatures the MAO in the human gut. So if you take a people like the Cofan in eastern Ecuador, you'll notice that they have, on the one hand, this shrub, a nondescript shrub in the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, full of tryptamines, and then they have the woody liana itself, Banisteriopsis capi. This bark has a series of beta-carbolines in it, harmine and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines found in the leaf. And here's the interesting question. How, in a flora of 80,000 species of vascular plants, did the shamanic vision find these two morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest and learn to combine them in this curious and powerful way? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which is quickly exposed as a meaningless euphemism. If you ask the Indians, they say, well, the plants teach us. Well, what does that mean? Schultes recorded the Sionis sequoia consistently could identify in the forest 17 different varieties of a woody liana, all of which was referable to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye as the same species. And when he inquired as to the nature of their classification, they looked at him as if he were a fool and said, everybody who's a botanist knows that. You take each one of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each one sings to you in a different key. Now, that wasn't going to get you a PhD in plant systematics at University of Colorado, but it's a hell of a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. But it also talks about a different way of knowing. Now, I recently traveled back to the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, and I wanted to share you very briefly both a message of hope and inspiration. You know, a lot of what we thought about the Amazon is all wrong. A lot of what I wrote about the Amazon 30 years ago is all wrong. We created this idea because of our concerns about the environmental threat to the Amazon, that the Amazon itself was this fragile, delicate place, a kind of counterfeit paradise. And that kind of ecological idea was echoed by our understanding of the indigenous people, because when anthropology first spilled over the Andes, when the first roads were built in the 1940s, the Indian people that we encountered were the marginal peoples of the basin, not marginal in terms of being primitive, but literally those who survived at the margins of the basin. But we know from the chronicles of the Spaniards that in 1541, there were literally millions of people living in the Amazon who subsequently were swept away by disease. And the question is, what became of those people? How did they live in that forest? We now know that, in fact, these marginal people are not necessarily typical of what once was in the Amazon. These marginal societies, like the Cofan and the Sionis Akoya and the Warani, they tend to be endogamous. They marry amongst themselves, often in open conflict with their neighbors, little specialization, little hierarchy, not particularly complex societies, largely hunting and gathering, swidden agriculture, and so on. But then, to our astonishment, we've suddenly seen that for 50 years before our eyes are the actual upcountry cousins of the great civilizations. These are the Eastern Tucanoan peoples. These are the people of the Anaconda.